Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that Iran has made one move that could force America to rethink its entire strategy in the Middle East. No missile has to hit Washington, no American city has to be attacked, and Iran does not even need to win a conventional war. The move is much more dangerous than that. Iran understands something that every major military power understands. The strongest army in the world can still be vulnerable when its opponent controls the conditions of the battlefield. And that is exactly where this story becomes shocking. For years, the United States has relied on overwhelming military power to maintain pressure across the Middle East. Aircraft carriers, fighter jets, missile defense systems, long-range aircraft, intelligence networks, and thousands of American personnel stationed across the region. On paper, it looks almost impossible for Iran to challenge that power directly. But Iran does not need to challenge America where America is strongest. Instead, Iran can force the United States to defend something much larger than a battlefield. It can force America to defend the global system that depends on the Middle East, and that system begins with energy shipping trade and one of the most important waterways on Earth, the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow passage connects the Persian Gulf with the wider world, and enormous amounts of energy pass through it every day. That means a crisis in this location would not remain an Iranian-American problem for very long. It could quickly become a global problem. Think about what happens when an oil tanker becomes nervous about entering a dangerous area. The ship slows down, insurance costs rise, companies begin changing routes, shipping companies demand higher premiums, markets react, governments start preparing for shortages, and suddenly a military confrontation thousands of miles away begins affecting people who have never heard the name of the battlefield. That is the strategic advantage Iran understands. It does not necessarily need to destroy American forces. It only needs to make the cost of protecting the region dramatically higher. And this is where the move becomes much more interesting. Instead of launching one massive attack, Iran could create uncertainty, small incidents, threats against shipping, military exercises, drone activity, cyber operations, missile deployments, naval movements, and sudden changes in military readiness. Each event by itself might appear manageable, but together they create something far more dangerous: uncertainty. And uncertainty is one of the most expensive weapons in modern warfare, because when governments do not know what their opponent will do next, they have to prepare for the worst possible scenario. America could respond by sending more aircraft, more ships, more missile defense, more surveillance aircraft, more troops. And every additional asset costs money. Every additional deployment creates risk. Every additional ship becomes another target. Every additional aircraft requires fuel, maintenance, protection, and logistics. Iran knows that it cannot easily outspend the United States, so why would it try? Instead, it can attempt to make America spend more and more resources simply maintaining security. That is a completely different kind of battlefield, and it is one of the reasons this strategy can be so difficult to counter, because there is no single target to destroy. There is no headquarters that can be captured. There is no army standing in one place waiting for a decisive battle. The battlefield becomes an entire network: ports, ships, air bases, radar systems, energy facilities, communication networks, and trade routes. This creates a nightmare for military planners because protecting everything is almost impossible. The United States can protect a carrier, it can protect an airbase, it can protect a convoy, but can it protect every commercial ship moving through a huge region every hour of every day? That is the question, and there is another problem. Iran does not operate alone in the strategic environment. The Middle East contains multiple governments, multiple armed groups, multiple alliances, and multiple countries with competing interests. That means a crisis can develop in several places at once. A single incident could force American planners to make a decision. Where should the resources go? Should they protect the ships? Should they protect American bases? Should they defend an ally? Should they increase air patrols? Should they respond militarily? Or should they avoid escalation? Every decision creates another vulnerability somewhere else, and this is where the title of this story becomes important. Iran may not need a military move that defeats America. It may only need a move that forces America to react. Because once America starts reacting, Iran gains something extremely valuable: the ability to influence the tempo of the conflict. The side controlling the tempo can sometimes determine what the other side is forced to defend, and that is a completely different form of power. Imagine an American commander watching several warning screens at the same time. One reports unusual naval activity, another reports a possible drone launch, another shows commercial vessels changing their routes, another reports increased military communications, and another warns that regional forces are moving. None of these events automatically means war, but together they create a question that military commanders hate. What happens next? That question alone can change behavior. Oil traders begin watching the news. Shipping companies begin calculating risk. Investors begin watching energy prices. Governments begin preparing emergency plans. And ordinary people eventually feel the consequences through fuel prices, transportation costs, and inflation. That is how a regional confrontation can become a global economic event, and Iran understands the value of that connection. The most important battlefield may not be the battlefield where soldiers fight. It may be the battlefield where governments calculate risk, because if Iran can convince markets that the region is becoming less predictable, then the economic pressure begins spreading without Iran having to physically control every route. This is what makes asymmetric strategy so powerful. A smaller power does not need to defeat a larger power in a traditional contest. It only needs to find the larger power's weaknesses. And one of America's biggest strengths can also become a weakness. America has global commitments, it has alliances around the world, it protects international shipping, it supports partners, it maintains military bases, it operates fleets across multiple oceans, and it has to think about threats in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. At the same time, Iran does not have to compete with all of that. It only has to focus on one region. That difference matters, because strategy is not always about who has more weapons. Sometimes it is about who can force the other side to use those weapons in the most expensive way. And there is another reason this situation could become extremely dangerous. Escalation does not always happen because someone wants a full-scale war. Sometimes escalation happens because both sides believe they are responding defensively. One side moves forces because it fears an attack. The other side sees those forces moving and assumes an attack is coming. So it moves more forces. The first side sees that movement and becomes even more nervous. Then another warning appears, and suddenly both sides are preparing for a war that neither side originally wanted. This is the nightmare scenario, because once military forces are positioned close enough to each other, every decision becomes more dangerous. A drone could be misidentified, a radar signal could be misunderstood, a missile could be launched accidentally, a ship could be approached too aggressively, and a single incident could create political pressure for retaliation. That is why the most powerful move may not be the loudest one. Sometimes the most powerful move is the one that keeps everyone guessing. Iran has spent years developing capabilities designed around exactly this kind of environment: missiles, drones, naval systems, underground facilities, mobile launch platforms, cyber capabilities, and networks of regional partners. These capabilities create a problem for any opponent trying to predict where the next threat could emerge, and that means America faces a difficult calculation. Destroying one capability does not necessarily eliminate the strategy. Another capability may remain, another location may become important, another group may become active, another route may become threatened, another crisis may appear. The problem becomes less about defeating one target and more about managing an entire ecosystem of threats. And this is where the economic dimension becomes impossible to ignore. If shipping becomes more expensive, energy becomes more expensive, insurance becomes more expensive, and transportation becomes more expensive, the effects can spread far beyond the Middle East. Factories pay more to move goods, airlines pay more for fuel, truck companies pay more for transportation, consumers eventually pay more for products, and governments face pressure from voters. Suddenly, something that began as a strategic maneuver between Iran and America becomes a political problem for leaders thousands of miles away. That is the real power of geography. You do not always have to control the entire world. Sometimes you only need influence over a location that the rest of the world cannot easily avoid, and that is why the Strait of Hormuz remains so important. It is not simply a piece of water, it is part of a global economic system, and anyone capable of threatening that system gains leverage far beyond the size of their conventional military. But there is an important warning. This strategy is incredibly dangerous for Iran as well. If the pressure becomes too extreme, America and its allies could respond with overwhelming force. Iran knows this, which means the goal would not necessarily be to cross the line into unlimited war. The goal could be to stay just below that line, pressure without total escalation, threat without complete destruction, risk without immediate collapse. That is a very difficult game, and one mistake could change everything. So what was the move America was not ready for? Perhaps it was never a single missile. Perhaps it was never a secret weapon. Perhaps it was the realization that Iran does not have to fight. America on America's terms, Iran can choose a battlefield where military strength alone does not guarantee victory. A battlefield made of shipping routes, energy markets, regional alliances, economic pressure, information, uncertainty, and time. Because time changes everything, a powerful military can win a battle quickly, but maintaining security across an entire region for months or years is something completely different. And that is where the real pressure begins. The question is no longer whether America can defeat Iran in a conventional military confrontation. The question becomes how much instability America is willing to absorb while preventing that confrontation from spreading. And that is a much harder question, because the moment a conflict begins affecting oil prices, shipping markets, military budgets, and global trade, everyone becomes involved, even countries that never wanted to choose a side. That is why the next move may not come with a dramatic announcement. It could come through a shipping warning, a military deployment, a sudden change in energy prices, a mysterious drone incident, a cyber disruption, or a few unexpected movements that seem insignificant when viewed separately. But when connected together, they could reveal the larger strategy. And if that happens, the world may discover that the most dangerous weapon in this confrontation was not necessarily something launched from the ground, it was leverage. Iran may have realized that when you cannot overpower the strongest military in the world, you do not always attack the military, you attack the assumptions behind its strategy. And if America is forced to spend enormous resources defending every possible threat, then the real battle may already be underway. Not in Washington, not in Tehran, but across the network that connects the Middle East to the entire global economy. And that is why the next move matters, because if Iran can turn a regional confrontation into a global strategic problem, then America will face a choice that becomes harder with every passing day: escalate, retreat, or continue defending a system that becomes increasingly expensive to protect. And whichever choice Washington makes, the consequences will not remain inside the Middle East. They could reach markets, businesses, governments, and millions of ordinary people around the world. The most dangerous part is that this story may only be beginning.